Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Life is really funny. Sometimes I will make a video or just talk about something that I find really interesting and nobody cares. Other times I'll say something really flippantly or just make a kind of off-the-cuff video and people care quite a bit. And that happened yesterday. I just made this really off-the-cuff video about how I kind of like ability score ranges that range from 1 to 5. I'm really kind of like coming around to those and liking that a little bit. And a lot of discussion, both in comments on my video. Complex Games Apologist made a kind of a video response in this private group. And I always love his private videos because generally it's him taking care of his son and talking to us at the same time. I had some discussion in that private group about this. And so I kind of wanted to make a follow-up video about this because I think it's a really fascinating subject. Ability scores or attributes or characteristics, whatever you want to call them, and how those relate to things like skills. And coming from somebody like me with that came from like really old school D&D roots, where we didn't need no stinking skills because the game didn't have any, and looking at it now and some of my perspectives. So this video isn't about Dungeons and Dragons. This video isn't about things like Ubiquity or Genesis or World of Darkness or anything else that uses that 5-point scale. It's not exactly about game design, although it kind of touches on it. I'm not really sure exactly what it's about, but I find this subject really, really interesting. So I figured we should talk about it a little bit more. So start off just maybe answering some questions, but going back and what I was talking about initially. The idea that you take, I made this great prop. It's a really professional prop. I hope you like this. This is my really super professional prop of checking out those ability score ranges. Now I've got our Dungeons and Dragons ability scores here, and you'll notice like if you're somebody that played like 3rd edition or whatever, a little bit different in terms of how they're grouped together. This is the basic. These are the Moldvay modifiers from 1981. And on the other hand, we've got our 5-point scale here. And what do these things kind of represent it from a narrative standpoint? And I talked a lot about in that other video. I've talked about for a long time the idea that these scores kind of you can conceive of them as representing the mean and then 3 standard deviations above and below the mean. And it's a really helpful way of thinking of them. It has nothing to do with the probabilities of how they're generated. It's just an easy way to kind of think of it. So, I was talking about before the idea that you got your Dungeons and Dragons line of ability scores here. You've got your 9 to 12, that's average, which would be a 2 in most of these 5-point scales. You've got your 6 to 8, that's below average, which would be a 1 in this point. Now you're looking at these, in theory. Not mechanically, the numbers don't add up, doesn't really matter. But just conceptually, you're looking at these people with 4 to 5 or 3. They're 2 and 3 standard deviations below the mean. These are people that are, I was trying to think of like words that wouldn't make people too upset, and I couldn't think of any. So, kind of like impaired and hopeless. These are people that, based on these raw ability scores, because we're not talking about skills, we're talking about the kind of, this is what we're working with here. This is what you were born with. This is how smart you are. This is your basic potential. This is how strong you are. This is your basic physique, how tough you are. Your mettle, your coordination, your panache, your willpower, your charisma, your je ne sais quoi, whatever it happens to be. Who knows? And because it depends on what the game lists as attributes or abilities or characteristics. These are things that tend to be incredibly hard to improve. So, most of the games have some kind of mechanism to improve these after character generation, but it generally takes an awful lot of experience to increase these scores. So this is mostly, when you have a score, this is what you're working with from character generation on. Then you've got on the other end of the scale, you've got your 13 to 15 or 3, which would be above average. In most cases, you're making a character in like basic D&D, or you're making like Ubiquity character, or Genesis character, as far as I can figure out. You're going to have characters that generally are going to have scores of 2s and 3s. You may want to decide to like have some kind of deficit and have a 1, so you're below average in some characteristics somewhere. Maybe you do that for flavor. Maybe you do that because that way in some kind of point buy, or if it's just random generation, whatever it happens to be. Maybe you're trying to get a score of 4 or 16 to 17, where you're exceptional. And then you've got your 18s or your 5, and that's like the best, the pinnacle of human potential. Just a side tangent, Jamie Prentice, Space Slim, was talking about the idea what happens after 18? And the idea that you can represent something like with a logarithmic scale. And so you're talking about your trolls, your giants, your whatever happens to be in another game where they're beyond human ability. I'm a person that's a big fan of those hard limits. 5 or 18. That's it. Like, people just do not get better than that. There may be something incredibly exceptional in the story, or the game world, where either it's not human or it's just some kind of incredibly augmented super, whatever happens to be. But this is something that's just not attainable by the average person, or even the above average person. It's just like, that's as good as it gets. That's the Andre the Giant, etc. So, as far as like what happens beyond those scores, it depends on the game. And once again, a lot of people said, well, a lot of it depends upon what your intention is. How granular do you want to get? How big of a spread do you want to have? Do you want to have that 3 to 18 spread? Do you want to have the 1 to 5? Do you want to have a percentage-based spread? What kind of differentiation do you want between characters in terms of those abilities? And to me, there's two ways you can represent these things. How much are you representing mechanically, and how much are you choosing to represent from a narrative standpoint? Do you need those scores? I think it was Chris Hall talking about the idea that it was a little tough to, it was easy to have scores of say a 9 and a 12, and you can conceptualize, okay, well, there's a difference between these two guys, even though they're both technically average. There's a difference you can conceptualize between the guy who has a 13 strength and a 15 strength. Whereas if you're just thinking to yourself, okay, well, this is a guy with a 3, and okay, he's above average, but the two of them together, is there any real difference between them? That's up to you kind of narratively. Mechanically, no. But once again, mechanically, is there a difference between the 13 and the 15 guy in basic D&D? No, unless you're doing a roll under ability check every once in a while. For the most part, most of that is just kind of narrative description of these guys. My character, Philippe Moreau, in All for One, he has an intelligence of 2. It is average. However, I play Philippe a lot closer to the bottom of that average scale. I guess in D&D parlance, he'd be a lot closer to a 9 than a 12. He misses a lot of things. It's just part of what makes him him. I mean, what I didn't want to have a guy that was stupid. I thought about for a second of giving him a 1 intelligence, but that's not what I was going after. I wasn't going after some kind of mechanical representation of how Philippe didn't notice things. It was more from a narrative standpoint. But really, really interesting. Once again, what's your intention with that? However, I'm going to butcher this name, but Masticina, and I'm not even going to try the last name of what is obviously a screen name, or hopefully a screen name, was talking about the idea, well, when I was talking about the idea that I like this kind of hard limit on the other end, in terms of let's not make our characters, really deficient, impaired, or hopeless, which is one of these advantages I like about this system of 1 through 5, where it doesn't kind of extend there. Or if you're going to play D&D, a lot of us play it this way. I think my iPad's slipping down here. A lot of us played D&D this way, where we didn't play characters that had these low scores. Those were generally deemed unplayable at that point. But Masticina was talking about the idea, when you have a character with that kind of deficit, this gives you the opportunity to have their teammates, the other people with them, to kind of fill in those gaps. You have one person that's not as smart, and one person that's smarter. One person that's not as strong, the person that kind of picks up the slack in that area. And I couldn't agree more. Except to me, that's better represented by the skill sets of the characters than by their raw abilities. And so here we enter into that realm of this realm between ability scores and skills. And what does that mean mechanically, and what does that mean narratively? In our private Facebook group, Brian pointed out the idea that sometimes it's really tough to figure out the difference. If you have a character, let's say we're using Ubiquity, or some games that also use this die pool system, where you start out with a raw attribute, you put a skill on top of it, and then you build your die pool from that. On paper, there's not a heck of a lot of difference between the guy with a strength of 4 and athletics of 2 trying to do something athletic than there is with the guy with a strength of 2, so he's average, not exceptional, and athletics of 4. What do we do? How do we represent those things differently? It depends on, you know, how you approach it. Are you simply approaching it from a mechanical standpoint, where you're rolling dice and saying yes you succeed or no you don't succeed, or are you looking at like, well, why did you succeed? You know, you put me up against some other guy and we're both just as strong. You know, this other guy that spent more times on the jungle gym or whatever it is, he's, you know, climbing trees, he's going to beat me in any kind of athletics test. Maybe the guy that's weaker than I am, he'll beat me in an athletics test as well. However, if we both have to pick up something really heavy, which Brian said, you know, at that point, what happens? You know, to me, most games represent the fact that the stronger guy picks up the heavy rock before, and he's able to pick up more stuff than the weaker guy, regardless of the skill that this guy has developed about athletics. Likewise, when, you know, these two characters, you know, the one with a very, you know, a lot of strength and one that's just average, but, you know, the flip side of athletics, you know, why did they succeed at the task? You can narrate why they succeeded. Did this guy succeed at climbing up the wall because he was simply that strong, or, you know, did his friend succeed in climbing up that wall because he was just that well trained? And skills represent these areas where your character has invested time. You as a player have invested points, or however, you know, experience points, or whatever, you know, currency the game uses to improve or create your character in order to build them in that way. But the character, you know, from a narrative fictional standpoint, they're skilled at these things because, not because they were born that way, but because they have invested time and resources and energy into developing those skills. It's a difference between being smart, like I am, and being smart and applying yourself in school, which I did not in high school. So I had friends that, you know, are doing incredible things. I didn't apply myself. I had some, you know, some friends that got much better grades than I did, which I know I was smarter than them, but they had worked on that skill, and that skill might have been academics at that point. You get the idea. But from a narrative standpoint, it's a little bit different. So to me, you know, that crosses, that gets in that line of like, well, just because things look equal on paper, you know, you still have this ability to narrate them differently, you know, which is one of the things, you know, I really like about approaching games in that way, where you're looking at not only why did you succeed, or why that you succeeded, but why did you succeed? Not just making games about rolling dice. I win, you know. Anyhow, that's off on a preference tangent. But it's a really, really fascinating subject when it comes right down to it. Trying to think if anybody said anything else that I want to talk about at this point. Oh yeah, going back to this standard distribution, or these, you know, these standard deviations above and below the mean. You know, Caius of Glantry actually asked a great question. He's like, well, you know, wait a minute. If you're just, you know, rolling 3d6, is that just your characters? Is that just the heroes, or is that everybody? Because if you're rolling 3 6-sided dice to generate these Dungeons and Dragons scores in this case, well then an incredible amount of people would be 3 standard deviations above the mean in some ability, and that's just not the way a population distribution happens. And of course, you know, to me, the idea of saying, you know, we're looking at, you know, 3 standard deviations above the mean with these scores here, that's just a ballpark approximation. That's not really based on, you know, the numerical probabilities of rolling dice or your point buy or what have you. Player characters play by different rules than average people. Doesn't mean they have to be incredibly above average. You know, most, you know, characters in, like, say, Ubiquity, basic D&D, you're gonna have a bunch of averages and some above averages, and that's about it. And you might have one below average. That tends to be, you know, what happens. They're not superhuman. However, when you stat out NPCs in most of these games, you know, I was loving it. I was reading Genesis today, reading like the minions and the I think it's rivals and adversaries or whatever. You know, as non-player characters become more and more important, you throw more stats at them. But, you know, a lot of us played for years that, you know, you really didn't need to apply any kind of ability scores to somebody, unless, you know, it's really important to say this guy is really stupid, but he is incredibly fast and nimble. So you give him a high dexterity and a low intelligence. That's it. End of story. Most people are just plain old average. So to answer, you know, Caius' question, at least, you know, from my experience, no, they don't play by the same rules. There isn't that big population distribution. And a 2, or, you know, 9 to 12, we'll say a 2, the average, is that average for an adventurer or average for a regular person? That's average. That's average for a regular person, in my experience. But a great question, and a great question, thing to think about in terms of game design, and how do you represent the abilities of your characters. Going back to skills a little bit, one of the arguments that I had and a lot of my peers had against skills for a long time was, we like, once again, we came from this era where there were no skills, and when skills got introduced, the effect it tended to have on us was like, hey, I used to be able to do all these things, or my guy used to be able to do all these things, and now he can't because doesn't have points. It doesn't have ranks in this skill. He can no longer do this. And I think a lot of that, not just in Dungeons and Dragons, but a ton of other games you pick up now and you read them and try to figure out how to play them. I think if you're doing that, it boils down to player error and game master error. When game master's a player, so it's player error. Just because you don't have a drive skill listed on your character sheet, or you haven't sunk points in drive, doesn't necessarily mean that your character cannot drive. What do those skills represent? Your ability to drive under duress, to pull off some fancy driving moves when it really counts. What are skills like investigation? Most people can figure stuff out. We are very smart animals, but when it really comes down to like solving some kind of enigma, there are people that are much better at it because they have taken the time to get trained at it. Academics, or whatever. You go on down the list. The person, most of us can persuade somebody to do something, but when the chips are down, it's the person that has put ranks into persuasion, has taken the time to learn how to do that through trial and error, and spend a lot of, invested a lot of resources in learning that skill. They're the one that's able to, match that with their intelligence or their charisma, and able to produce results. So to me, that's a better way of looking at those skills. And once again, when you're narrating why did you fail or why did you succeed, it gives you clues in terms of how to frame that. So, this video is a little bit all over the place, but it's because it's a really fascinating topic. And so, hopefully that clears up a little bit more of my thought pattern. Is there a right and wrong way to do ability scores in terms of how granular they get? No, it's personal preference. It's game designer preference. It's what was the actual intent. But to me, what's more important than the numbers on the paper is like, how are you narrating that? Once the mechanics have been taken care of, when you're looking at this and figuring out like, how do I represent this character? That's where it becomes much more interesting to me. So, what about you?